But not only is it an annual event, it is the sort of keynote for our year. The reason for that is because it honors the memory of Dr. Sonja Stone, someone who was not only a visionary presence here on campus, but someone whose leadership we would probably welcome in these political times of today, regardless of where you fall on the political spectrum. One of the things that we've been fortunate to have been able to accomplish, and that is that the folks that have come back to share their research, wisdom, thoughts, and ideas with us have all been individuals that in their own right have been very, very accomplished. But tonight we are absolutely doubly satisfied to bring back someone who knows this place well and has sunk her fingers into some of the details that made the Stone Center possible. So we are very, very, very happy to have her back here with us. I'm also very happy to see all of you here. As many of you know, the Stone Center is one of those centers on campus that is responsible for reaching out to the community beyond the boundaries of the campus, and we're very happy and proud when we see that you respond to that call. So thank you very much for coming out on a very rainy, somewhat dreary night. I'm quite sure tomorrow the sun will come up again and we'll be ready to go back and run our task. And Ange-Marie, of course, will be back off to California, where it's probably much sunnier than it is here right now. But in any case, this is a proud moment for us, and thank you very much for sharing. I'm going to ask you to follow the line of the program, and folks will come up as they're called. But before I do that, I cannot allow the Chancellor to come up without doing a small introduction and letting you all know that Chancellor Folk has been very special for the Stone Center. I can tell you that in her time here, and this is not to cast any aspersions on any past chancellors, she has been here at the Stone Center more than, at least, and in my 16 years here, than all of the other chancellors combined. She has really made the Stone Center a home, a second home for her. We're glad that she's done so, and I'm going to ask her to come up now to give some remarks and also welcome the speaker to the campus.
Good evening, everyone. You know, I was just listening to Joseph welcome all of you, and it is true. I do feel an incredible welcome here every single time I come, and so I'm very grateful for that. And I think, in part, it's because this special place carries the history with it. You know, we don't always feel the history of how places began and what they carry with them in every place we go, but this Stone Center does carry that for everybody that comes in the door. And I think it's reinforced by the beauty and the primacy of its position. It's right here in the center of the campus, where I think the pioneers that fought hard to bring it here wanted it to be. It's a place that people come. It has this incredible architecture, but I have to say, I also am taken by the posters and the art that are in here, because I think we're inspired by people and we're inspired by the beautiful art. So thank you, Dr. Jordan, for helping to lead this center to be such a wonderful community place for our intellectual growth and stimulation. And tonight's lecture is perfect. It's a wonderful chance to welcome two-time alum, Dr. Ange-Marie Hancock, here for this coming home for this wonderful lecture. And as you heard, this is really one of the center's most important and signature programs. And it's great to see so many students. So how many students are here today? Just look at that. I just have to say thank you. That is wonderful to see all those students here. How about faculty and staff? Great. And community members? Look, see, this is fantastic. Every time we have a great event at Chapel Hill, you see that wonderful mixing of people coming together from all aspects of our university community, so it's fantastic to see people here. You know, this has been a very emotional week, And I think coming together around something so important as the lecture tonight is wonderful for all of us. I think we're all looking for places to be, to think, to talk about what we believe in and what we see for the future. And this is a time that really calls for that. I think about it a lot because being on a college campus at an election, especially one that has been contentious and so close, is interesting because you think most of the voters on our campus, or a big chunk of them, have never voted before. So this is the defining election in their lives. So that's another great privilege of our privileged work, is that we get to be a place where people talk about things like that and think about that at such important formative times. And so what a great opportunity to have you here to speak to us right now. Dorothy Height, educator and civil women's rights activist who won the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 1994, said, "We had people of all backgrounds coming together. And coming together, there was a kind of sense of caring and a feeling of joint responsibility. I think we all share a responsibility for the future, and we draw strength from strength. We draw strength from the stories and the testimonies we hear of other people, and that leads to a strength for the future. And this is the perfect venue for us to come together in that type of drawing strength from strength. The Stone Center, Dr. Sonja Stone, as all of you know, a wonderful, beloved professor, center advocate, and her name is what we honor with this building. There have been a number of events just in the last few weeks that made me think a lot about strength from strength and storytelling and talking about the issues we're about to discuss. And I'm just going to take a minute to mention them because I think they're important right now. The first is that just right here in this building, a couple days ago, we had a performance called the Black Pioneers Project. And I don't know how many of you were able to attend that, but it was truly amazing. It was in the other theater. It was a student project of oral history telling of Black pioneers from 1952 to 72. These were the students that came here and faced incredible challenges and told their stories, and they made one of the most wonderful oral history projects I've seen. It's very moving. You laugh, you cry, you celebrate, and you really learn. That was just here a couple days ago. And it's something that I think we can feel excited about. It was homecoming, and so the Black Alumni Reunion had their alumni dinner, and they honored another amazing pioneer with the Harvey E. Beach Outstanding Senior Award. And all of you know that Harvey was the first African American to graduate from UNC 1952 law school graduate. I think that was very important. This week, Carolina Hall, the exhibit that contextualizes the history of the change of the naming of that hall when it was first named, Saunders Hall, all the way through to today, to the renaming of the hall to Carolina Hall. The project has been opened, and there is an exhibit there that we're really encouraging people to go see. It's a very moving exhibit, and again, it's a chance to tell the true and full history so that we can build a true and full future. I would love to go on with many things, but you got a much better set of issues and a person to listen to than to me. But I just wanted to say that these ways that we face both our past and our future are what make a university such a special place. And so it's an honor to be here today. It's an honor to welcome Dr. Hancock back home for her lecture, Scaling Up Stories for Justice. Last story I'll tell you is just also less than, I guess this was on the weekend, we had Margot Lee Shatterly here. I don't know, any of you might not know her. She's an amazing author, and she just wrote a book, Hidden Figures, The American Dream, an Untold Story of the Black women mathematicians who actually helped write the code that got John Glenn to the moon. So these stories are wonderful and inspiring, and let's talk some more tonight. Thank you so much for being here.
Dr. Sonja Stone was born in Chicago in 1938. As a graduate student, she did extensive work with the Northeastern Illinois University Department of Inner City Studies. acting at various times as its director, chairman, and associate professor. She came to UNC at Chapel Hill in 1974 as an assistant professor and was the director of the curriculum in Afro-American Studies until 1979. She was named an associate professor in 1984. An admired teacher, she won the Favorite Faculty Award from the class of 1990. The same year, she was the first recipient of the Outstanding Black Faculty Award from the UNC at Chapel Hill General Alumni Association. Her many other honors included the Black Students Movement's 1983 Faculty Award, its 1980 Award for Excellence Academic Achievement, the 1982 North Carolina Alumni and Friends Coalition Award for Achievement in Higher Education, and the 1978 National Council for Black Studies Dedicated Service Award. These awards are a reflection of her passion for educating students and her desire to help them see themselves as change agents. Former students have described Stone as regal, challenging, unwavering in her expectations of greatness inside the classroom and outside the classroom. Dr. Stone was the advisor for the Black Student Movement from 1974 to 1980 and was an active role in promoting the minority presence on campus. Her voice was critical in establishing and expanding the Afro-American Studies curriculum at Carolina. She was a member of the campus-wide advisory board and various professional and honorary organizations, including the National Council for Black Studies, the NAACP, Women's Equity Action League, and the North Carolina Association of Educators. Dr. Stone's history with the Stone Center dates back to the initial planning stages when she served faithfully as the Black Cultural Center Planning Committee member. She had a powerful voice in the Black Cultural Center discussions, which were sometimes challenging with the notion that the center should be fashioned as a multicultural center instead. Once the center was established in 1988, Dr. Stone served on the advisory board and worked diligently to ensure the center received the support it needed during its early years. Once the center was after Dr. Stone passed away, in 1991, students, inspired by her example, began mobilizing to advocate for a freestanding faculty to be named after her. Around that time, students and their supporters noted publicly that Carolina hadn't named any buildings after African American women or men at that time. Thus, this was an opportunity to both honor Stone and remedy the omission of African Americans from the ranks of named buildings at UNC-Chapel Hill. Dr. Stone's work life on through the Sonja Hayes Stone Center for Black Culture and History, and in the hearts and minds of all those she touched. The annual Sonja Hayes Stone Memorial Lecture is dedicated to her memory and to the standard of excellence, advocacy, and activism she left as her legacy. Thank you.
All right. Ange-Marie Hancock-Alfaro is an associate professor of political science and gender studies at the University of Southern California's Dornsife College of Letters, Arts, and Sciences. Dr. Hancock-Alfaro is the author of several books about intersectionality, politics, and social justice. In 2004, she published the award-winning The Politics of Disgust and the Identity of the Welfare Queen. In 2011, she published the timely Solidarity Politics for Millennials, and earlier this year, Intersectionality and Intellectual History was published by Oxford University Press. Dr. Hancock-Alfaro is also the founder and executive director of RESIST, the Research Institute for the Study of Intersectionality and Social Transformation. RESIST serves as a platform for sharing knowledge and training social justice researchers and practitioners in effectively supporting the work of social transformation. In addition to the ongoing work of RESIST, Hancock is working on 2 new manuscripts, Scaling Up Stories for Justice, on which tonight's talk is based, as well as a memoir tentatively titled Runaway from Home. Hancock-Alfaro has appeared in multiple media outlets, including The Melissa Harris Perry Show, The Young Turks. She has been quoted in the New York Times, Forbes, and FoxNews.com. Professor Hancock-Alfaro is a regular political expert on KCAL 9 Sunday Morning News Show and has appeared on NPR's Marketplace and News and Notes. During the 2008 election, she served as an international expert in American politics for the U.S. Department of State. Ange-Marie Hancock-Alfaro received her bachelor's degree from New York University and, as the chancellor has said, her MA and PhDs right here from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, so she is a proud Tar Heel. While here, she worked on programming for the Sonja Stone Center, so she was not only a student, but she was integral in making a difference to this center. Prior to graduate school, however, Hancock-Alfaro worked for the National Basketball Association, where under the mentorship of NBA Hall of Famer Satch Sanders, she conducted preliminary research and created the original business model for the Women's National Basketball Association, better known as the WNBA. Other professional contributions include her work as founding co-editor of the Western Political Science Association's Politics, Groups, and Identities Journal. She is also a member of the APSA's Executive Council and a board member of the Liberty Hill Foundation. All week, I have been reflecting on Guyanese poet Martin Carter's "This is the Dark Time, My Love." He writes, "This is the dark time, my love. All around the land, brown beetles crawl about. The shining sun is hidden in the sky. Red flowers bend their heads in awful sorrow. This is the dark time, my love. It is the season of oppression, dark metal, and tears. It is the festival of guns, the carnival of misery. Everywhere the faces of men are strained and anxious. Who comes walking in the dark nighttime? Whose boot of steel stamps down the slender grass? It is the man of death, my love, the stranger invader, watching you sleep and aiming at your dream." While I won't presume that everyone in tonight's audience regarded last week's election result with the same trepidation that I do, those results remind us of the necessity and value of intersectional analysis, understanding the past, understanding our present, as we seek to engage in empathy, justice, and possibility. Professor Hancock-Alfaro's scholarly and practical work offers a framework to organize and thrive in these dark times. I am eager to hear her talk, which is entitled "Scaling Up Stories for Justice, a Role in Black Lives Matter for Every Sector of Our Community," which highlights the way that philanthropists, activists, allies, and policymakers can incorporate Black humanity into sustainable social transformation. Please join me in welcoming Professor Ange-Marie Hancock-Alfaro.
So I want to say thank you very, very much to the Stone Center, to Dr. Jordan, especially to Sharif, who has been conducting all of the many, many different details that I remember somewhat fondly as a program coordinator that gets involved in putting together an event of this magnitude. I'm thrilled. I can't even begin to express how thrilled I am to be back here at Carolina, at my intellectual home. To see some familiar faces and many new faces is especially gratifying. As Dr. Jordan and Dr. Shields both mentioned, I did work for 3 years as a program coordinator as a graduate student. I was one of those graduate students who needed to have 2 and 3 jobs. I'm sure there's some grad students in the audience who understand what that's like. I had to make sure yesterday when I was here in town, and it was such a beautiful day, to actually walk to my old apartments. So I went back to 1000 Smith Level Road, apartment E11, and I went over to Estes Park over on Estes Drive in Carborough. And it really felt good to be back here and to see that skies are still Carolina blue. No matter what else happens, the skies will still be Carolina blue. So today I want to talk a little bit about several things. So as Dr. Shields mentioned, I do want to talk about how do we restart the conversation. Following what happened last week, no matter kind of what we thought about the outcome, the tone of the campaign, the way in which this is not a normal campaign. And historians will try and say that, yes, there have been contentious campaigns before. And I think that's absolutely true. But I think for the folks who experienced it, as Chancellor Folt was talking about, this felt new. So even if it's not particularly new, we were not around in the 19th century, in the 1800s, to experience some of those elections. And I think for those of us who were really either triggered or traumatized or just flat out disappointed in the way in which the campaign was conducted, I think it felt new to us. And that's something I think we should talk about. So I want to talk a little bit about how we got here. And then I want to talk about the Black beloved community and who we are in this movement. And then I've been doing some research in Black philanthropy. You'll hear a little bit more about my role in fundraising for the Stone Center back when I was here in the 1990s. And I think that's going to be an important thing that we talk about going forward. I think I'm a lifetime member of the Alumni Association, so I get the magazines. And so I see what's going on in North Carolina, and I think it's something that we have to talk about here at Carolina in particular as a path forward. When the legislature sees fit to not give us what we deserve, how are we going to make sure that our legacy continues here? And then the last thing is to really talk about allyship and solidarity. And some words just don't translate completely into English, and so I use the word compañera because I think it really communicates something beyond just what it means to be an ally or what it means to stand in solidarity. So I'm looking forward to a good conversation tonight. So let's talk a little bit about how we got here. Now I know that because I come from the political science department, there will be events that talk about the election of 2016 and some amount of data detail. And so I want to give you a little bit of data that the political scientists might not share with you because it's demographic data and not political science data. Let's look at the United States in 2010. So 6 years ago, this is based on census data. I'm a member of the program for environmental and regional equity at USC. And we created these two maps to really show the demographic changes that have happened in the United States. And so if you look at the map on your left, you'll see those are the baby boomers. So in 2010, those who were 65 and above. And if you look at the percent people of color among the baby boomer generation, you'll see that there is not so much racial and ethnic diversity. Certainly not so much racial and ethnic diversity as the youngest members of our community here. If you look at those who were just being born in 2010 or who had been born in 2006 to 2010, you'll see that the percentages of people of color, and that's people of color, so that includes African Americans, blacks who are not African American but immigrated to the United States, Latinos, Asian Americans, Native Americans, people of mixed race, those percentages are much, much higher, right? And you can also see, and I want to make sure you locate our beloved state, North Carolina here, I want you to also see where those percentages people of color are highest. And so if you were to draw a map that looks at voter ID policies, that looks at the way in which there are certain kinds of anxieties and how they're playing out at the state level in particular about change, here's one part of the explanation, these demographic changes. Now these demographic changes are a product of things like maternal birth rates, certainly we have a public health scholar here, but also a product of public policies, right? The 1965 Immigration Act, the 1986 Immigration Reform and Control Act, and different immigration policies as well. But the point here is these demographic changes were set in place long before 2016, long before 2008. And so these changes are a lot like tectonic plates, demographers will tell you. They are moving underneath the earth, whether we like it or not, whether we intend for them to happen or not, right? So I say that to say these demographic changes are not intentional. And I think it's important to hold that note, that these are demographic changes that are not intentional. So just as the San Andreas Fault does not intend to wake me out of my sleep in Los Angeles when it decides to have an earthquake, neither do these demographic changes intend to do anything in terms of disturbing our peace of mind about the society that we live in. Now, that said, we still have something that the demographers have identified as the cultural generation gap. And the cultural generation gap is based on the idea of baby boomers and millennials having not just age differences, not just political possibly differences, but having very real racial and ethnic differences as well. And those differences have produced, based on the intervention of political entrepreneurs, so in other words, in a confusing situation, people then intervene to try and explain those confusing situations. And those explanations have tapped into the anxiety of both generations. To give you just a little bit of illustration. Baby boomers in 2008, most of them who were 65 and above were looking towards a very nice kind of life, a retirement, a let's slow down and see if we can enjoy life. Not because they want it to go away. Okay, baby boomers, especially in Los Angeles, still want to be young, still want to be active and engaged. Okay, we've got a whole strip of plastic surgeons in Beverly Hills. So I think, even though most baby boomers around the rest of the country aren't so much interested in the Botox, they are interested in still being engaged and relevant, just not having to do it with a 9-to-5 job. But those folks who were thinking that in 2008, then experienced 2009. 401ks dropped precipitously. People couldn't quit their job, or people were laid off from their jobs at late ages, in their 50s, in their 60s, 3 years from retirement, 5 years from retirement, 10 years from retirement. And just imagine, if you will, what that anxiety might have generated. To know that you've done everything you were supposed to do. You worked hard, you raised your family, you paid your mortgage on time, and then through no fault of your own, not those tectonic plates, but through no fault of your own, you would find yourself in this situation. Imagine what kind of anxiety that might produce. On the other hand, you have millennials. We have lots of students in here. Anybody have an older brother or sister? So we have several with siblings in here. Okay. Imagine those siblings in 2008 and 2009. They too had been told, work hard, do well, finish your education, take out that student loan, it's going to be okay. And then 2009 rolls around, and there are no jobs. And those loans are still going to come due. And so you can again imagine the anxiety that's produced among the millennial generation. So you have this cross-generational anxiety going on about the changes that the people are experiencing in their own lives, and they are encouraged through political entrepreneurs to blame that anxiety on the demographic changes that are going forward. So you have these tectonic plates of demography that are changing, and then you have people who are anxious across generations, wondering, how did we get here if I in fact did everything I was supposed to do? I worked hard in high school. I got into college. I was told if I went to college and I got my BA, I'd be able to get out and get a job. What about that? The folks who worked for 30 years, whether they worked in multiple jobs or they worked in one job, did what they were supposed to do, raised their kids to be law-abiding citizens, and now what? So you have this anxiety that's going on that's searching for a solution, searching for an explanation. And you have certain folks who want to tell them that the reason that these anxieties are out here, the reason why this is happening to you, is because of those demographic changes. Part of the reason why we have that explanation and why people are so susceptible to that explanation, even if they are otherwise good, fine, upstanding citizens who don't think of themselves as being biased or prejudiced, is because of something called the oppression Olympics. Now, I'm not going to go into every single one of these particular rings, but you'll notice they are not colored like the Olympics that we just watched this past summer, because they are not designed to create unity. They are designed to divide us. They are designed to destroy the bonds that we have between us and among us. And so you have things like compassion deficit disorder, where people can't, because they're so anxious about their own situation, generate any kind of care and concern for the person next door, any kind of care and concern for someone who doesn't look like them, right? Or whose children don't look like my grandkids or my sons and daughters. That is a main driver, a main filter through which some of this information is filtering in our minds, which makes otherwise good people then think the solution is to make sure that those people don't get any further. Because what? I'm worried they'll leapfrog over me and get what was due to me. And so one of the main cross-generational barriers that we're facing is that millennials think baby boomers are in the way, and baby boomers think millennials are entitled and not doing what they're supposed to be doing. And as you have those kinds of breakdowns, you're going to continue to have this anxiety that produces a couple of troubling things which you and I saw in 2016. So I wrote this book in 2011, and it gives me absolutely zero pleasure to tell you that I was right. Self-interest at the expense of the common good. And more importantly, in terms of what we've seen over the past several months, in decreased tolerance and increased bias. When you see people punched at a political rally, when you see people targeted, when you see churches being burned down, these kinds of things have happened in the past, absolutely. But the people who are here now are experiencing them anew. And that's something that I think we really have to talk about. So part of how we got here was those tectonic plates were then blamed for things that they were not responsible for to assuage Americans' anxiety about what was going on. The reason why that explanation came up is because in most social movements literature, there is something called the signal spillover blowback cycle. So as a particular movement or as a particular political effort takes place, it provides a signal about what to do right or what to not do wrong in the future. And so you could talk about this in terms of the civil rights movement, you could talk about this in terms of Brown versus Board of Education and how it served as a signal for then how women's activists wanted to then go through the courts to get their rights, and then LGBT folks wanted to go through courts to get their rights. That kind of signal, right, then can have ripple effects across groups. I would argue to you that the 2008 election of Barack Obama was one such signal. It signaled to those who voted for Barack Obama that we live in a society that is open enough to elect the first African American president of the United States. It also served as a signal to those who were against Barack Obama, for whatever reason, ideological or otherwise, to then exploit the anxieties that are about race and ethnic changes here in our society, to make sure that there could be a blowback part of the cycle, to literally set up barriers. And so when we think about this cycle and we think about those oppression Olympics that we use as filters to, that we carry around in our heads, we can really then speak to what we should do in November. Knowing now what we know about those demographic changes not being responsible for why there were layoffs in 2009, why there are still high student loans, for example, we can think about how do we actually get from trauma to recovery. And so I want to tell a little story. Chancellor Folt was talking about stories, and I did have a couple inserted into my talk. You'll see on the left here just a little post-it that circulates on Facebook that says, take what you need, and at the bottom it says faith and patience and courage, all other kinds of things, love, beauty. And then on the far right, you'll see a symbol that talks about the wound being the place where the light gets let in. And so if we think about trauma and the things that we've experienced, whether we've experienced them right in the past 6 months, or whether we're anxious about experiencing them going forward, okay, as Professor Shields was talking about in the poem that she read. We have to remind ourselves that just like this student, almost 1 year to the day ago, right outside of South Building, because I was actually here 1 year ago and I went to the BSM protest that happened a year ago. She's holding a sign that says, "We gon' be all right." And so one of the things I think we really have to slow down and remind ourselves is that we're going to be all right. That's not to dismiss the anxiety. That's not to say that the anxiety doesn't feel real, because it does. And it's not to say that there's not a very real threat. But part of recovering from the trauma is knowing that we gon' be all right. Not today, not tomorrow, maybe not next month. But in the long run, we can be all right. And we don't want to lose sight of that we're going to be all right. When we talk about how people have actually responded to this idea of the election of Donald Trump, one thing that has been circulating among many college campuses in response to undocumented students is to make college campuses a formal sanctuary where ICE and other government officials cannot enter to actually arrest or otherwise detain students who are here without papers. I don't know whether that will happen here in North Carolina. I don't know whether that's a threat here in North Carolina, but that is one thing that has happened. Another thing it's important to note is that there is a movement among scholars to really re-engage with the Black radical tradition. And one way that my colleague Robin Spencer has talked about it is to actually re-engage with Cedric Robinson's Archive of Resistance, as she puts it. And I'd be happy to share the link to that article with anybody who'd be interested later on. Well, let's talk a little bit about future resistance. Why do you think I say we gon' be all right? Well, I say that because I do live in California, and it's not, oh, thank God I don't live in North Carolina. I lived here for 4 years. I love this state, okay? But where North Carolina is in 2016 is very similar to where California was in the mid-1990s. In California in the mid-1990s, there had been a series of statewide ballot initiatives, meaning the popular vote. People had voted for several different initiatives that were really about this demographic anxiety. So in other words, the demographic changes that North Carolina is experiencing here, and it had just started when I moved away in 1999, had already happened in California in the early 1990s. And the way in which voters responded was to pass things like Proposition 187, which was to deny any public resources to those who were undocumented. They passed Proposition 209, and I'll never forget because the college Republicans here at UNC invited the architect of Proposition 209, which banned affirmative action, to campus, Ward Connerly. He came and he spoke in the student union. And I went as a graduate student because that's what we do at Carolina. We invite people we agree or disagree with to have a discussion about the ideas and to air out the ideas. And I asked him a question. I stood up and asked him a question. And I said, I'm more qualified than most of my white high school classmates. Should I not have gotten in? He didn't have an answer for me. And that's okay. But that's what we do on a college campus. We challenge people and people come back at us. He didn't have an answer, but someone else might have had an answer for me, for sure. So in California in the 1990s, they had passed all of these statewide initiatives. And I know that there have been statewide bills here in North Carolina that many of you are upset about, HB 2 being one of them, and some of the things that have gone on here at Carolina in terms of funding in relationship to the state legislature. But what I want to tell you about California in 2016 versus the 1990s is that the criminal justice reform that was passed in California this year was a direct repeal of the 3 strikes law that was passed in the 1990s. Again, out of these racial anxieties and these ethnic anxieties. The repeal of 187 and the restoration of bilingual education that happened in 2016 was a direct repeal of what had happened in the 1990s. Now, you can look at me and say, oh, but California is so blue. It's easy to do that kind of stuff in California because there's so many Democrats and those Republicans, they're running scared. That's actually not the case. In the 1990s, there was a Republican governor named Pete Wilson. There was a majority of Republicans in the state Senate, and they got these bills on the books, and California voters passed them. So we have that system where you can actually pass through direct vote. The state legislature didn't have to do anything. So how do we get from the 1990s, 187, 209, the three strikes law, and get to this past week, where California, not only at the national level, but at the state level, reversed itself within a 20-year period? It wasn't just about party registration. People rolled up their sleeves, they learned how to organize, and they kept at it. So yeah, they were upset when 187 passed in 94, and when the three strikes law passed in 94. But they took these past 20 years to build the consensus among voters. Because again, the state legislature couldn't do anything for them to actually get those things changed. Did they win everything? No. Prop 22, which outlawed same-sex marriage in 2000, passed with 60% of the vote. In 2008, the same day that California helped elect Barack Obama, Proposition 8 passed with 53% of the vote. Again, banning same-sex marriage in California. So I'm not saying this to say that there's a perfectly rosy picture. What I'm saying is that when you get in and you organize, which is different from protesting, let me be clear, very different from protesting, very different from showing up for one day and holding a banner or marching to South Building or anything else. Getting there to organize means every day meeting with people, talking with people, doing your power analysis, and I'll explain what a power analysis is if you don't know what a power analysis is, and changing hearts and minds, which means you gotta talk to people you don't like, which means you gotta listen to them on Facebook even though it hurts you, which means you can't just shut them down by trolling. You have to engage with people who think differently from you to understand the way in which you're going to be able to live together in the future. Not easy to do. So much easier, put our earbuds in and not listen to anybody who disagrees with us. But we have to listen to them. So who are we in this beloved community? I want to talk first about what we mean when we talk about Black Lives Mattering. And so as you can see up here, there is, from the Movement for Black Lives Mattering, a policy vision for Black lives in the center there. But there is also, again, from 1 year ago, that UNC stands with Mizzou sign that was right in front of South Building. And I'll tell another little story. I've already told her about it, so she won't be embarrassed by it or anything. But Chancellor Folt did not know me until before this evening. And what she didn't know was that I could recognize her from my Carolina Alumni magazine. And I stood about 10 feet from Chancellor Folt at this protest. And again, she didn't know me, but I knew her. And I just watched and listened. And what I saw was someone modeling exactly what I just talked about. Listening, wanting to hear, wanting to understand what was going on here on this campus and why it was taking place across multiple campuses, including USC's. What I will say, having been here, having been part of the movement for the Stone Center being built, is that what happened at USC's campus was nothing compared to what you all did at Carolina a year ago. And so I'm going to ask you, this is your one audience participation, give yourselves a round of applause for what you were able to do last year. Even if you weren't there, even if the people who graduated are not in this room right now, you were part of a legacy. And it is important for you to recognize that legacy and know that you can carry it forward. Again, you and me, we gonna be all right. The other important thing about the beloved Black community is that it is intersectional. I know you have Alicia Garza coming tomorrow. She'll talk about Black Lives Matter in a very specific way, so I won't go too much into detail here. But when we talk about it being intersectional, we mean that this beloved community looks a lot different from Martin Luther King's beloved community. It means the Bayard Rustins of today don't have to hide in the closet. It means that this movement has been founded by Alicia, Opal, and Patrice. Opal and Patrice are both friends of mine, 3 queer Black women, which means that women don't have to stay in the closet. They don't have to be Ella Baker hiding behind and organizing from behind. They can be out front and behind at the same time, creating an inclusive movement that accounts for gender discrimination, that accounts for sexual orientation discrimination. And so it's very hard to see here, but you'll see a couple of other examples of how this movement is intersectional. The black square in the middle is actually designed to have the Say Her Name part of the movement represented. All of the names of Black women who have been killed at the hands of police. So one of the things that is different from traditional civil rights movements is that this is an intersectional movement. It is deliberately inclusive, and inclusive not in a, as long as you stay quiet, it will be okay if you're here, but that we appreciate all of your body, and we want all of you in this movement. Not just the piece that's the same as us, not just the piece that makes us comfortable, but all of you. And I think that's a really important credit to the Black Lives Matter movement. So when we think about a social movement, intersectional social movements like Black Lives Matter ask the question, when are social movements going to be sufficient for transformative change? But they ask that question considering that this is an unjust world. So they don't focus on the idea that one single intervention or one single thing is going to be enough to change everything. So the folks who are doing the intersectional social movement of Black Lives Matter, who have been doing this, especially Patrice, who I've known for 9 years, has been doing this long before there was a hashtag Black Lives Matter. She's been organizing for criminal justice reform and Black Lives Mattering long before it was called that. And the important thing about Patrice's kinds of movements is that they didn't look at the election of Barack Obama as the sudden resolution of everything. So that's what I mean by an intersectional approach asks for transformative change in an otherwise unjust world. Meaning this is the first step in what will be a long line of steps, rather than thinking of one change, one campaign, one election being the defining moment. Now, if I was giving this talk in 2008, you would have a hard time believing me, because everybody that I know voted for Barack Obama was really hoping this will be it. This will be it, we will be able to cut it, and it will be done, okay? But we didn't elect Barack Obama Jesus. We elected him President of the United States, and we live in a democracy where Congress and the Supreme Court also have a say in somebody's outcomes and somebody's power. And so the idea here is both that we have that opportunity again to take this election and to really think this is a moment and not a permanent existence. We gonna be all right. Now there are several approaches to social movements. I won't go through all of them, but I will talk about transformative organizing, and then later when I talk about allies and compañeras, I'll talk about deep political solidarity politics, because I think each one of those is really important to us being all right following this election. So for transformative organizing, we're talking about, again, something that is more than just organizing a protest. Something that is about more than just writing up a manifesto and demanding that university officials or state legislatures actually agree with it. We're talking about deep changes And not just deep changes in, you state legislator need to vote differently, but deep changes in who we are as people. It is based on building relationships, rather than simply, I need your vote, and you will not see me again until 4 years from now when I need your vote again. It also relies on many habits of deep political solidarity. And the other important thing of transformative organizing is that it goes beyond the idea of just hope and change. Bless Obama's heart. It focuses on the idea of transformation. That we, in transforming ourselves and transforming each other and transforming the policies that we enact, will actually allow us to get to a point where some changes will not go backwards. It's not easy, and it's not going to be the kind of thing that people take lightly. It will be fought against, it will be resisted, and you have to prepare for the fact that it will be resisted. Transformative organizing relies on what I call a power analysis, and those power analyses assist in strategic mobilization of supporters by asking 4 main questions. And this is particularly important in a state like North Carolina or a state like California 20 years ago, where there are so many things that need to be changed, right? And the question is, for folks who are like-minded, which one are we going to do first? Where are we going to start? How are we going to get this done? And it's very easy to say, okay, we're going to try and do everything all at once. A power analysis helps you to really sort through what the agendas are and have the tough-minded, data-driven conversation that says, we have the power to do this right now, we do not have the power to do that right now. In 2012 in California, there was a decision that was made among an alliance of groups called California Calls, and they had to decide whether or not they were going to invest in a fair and minimum wage, whether they were going to invest in tax reform and get a tax increase to further fund education, whether they were going to focus on reforming the criminal justice system or repealing the death penalty. All 4 were possibilities on the ballot. And California Calls, led by a guy named Anthony Thigpen, had a really hard conversation and said, we don't have the power to get all 4 of these passed in 2012. We have the power to get 1 of these passed. And so we're not going to work against all the other groups who want some of these other changes, but we as a coalition have to make a tough decision about which one we're going to invest in. And they decided to invest in tax reform, and that tax reform not only passed, it was one of the only tax increases to pass in the entire country. And it's a tax on the wealthiest people in the state of California. It was also just renewed in 2016. And so again, this idea that you do your analysis to help you sort through your agenda, and also to identify who's in opposition. And then last, but certainly not least, who are our allies, and how are we going to rely on ourselves? So what kind of power can we build among ourselves? And then where are the places where allies can kind of fit in and work with us? The next thing I want to talk about, we did, I don't even know what. We did so many different events to raise this $1 million. And I say that to say, if there is a need here at the Stone Center again, I'm telling you, students, you can do it. This place should not go without funding because we have, even in this room, enough people to put something together that the legislature can't touch. But as we think about that on a more structural level, I want to talk about why diverse donors matter, and why diverse donors matter to social movements more than ever. And part of that does have to, again, do with demographics. If you look at 1970, the gray bar is 83% of the population was white or European American. In 2050, that percentage will be less than 46%. The point here is not to create anxiety about this, but to see this as an opportunity. There is a tremendous amount of wealth transfer that will take place between now and 2050, most major philanthropic donations are made through estates and trusts. And so we want to think about how can we be smart about funding the movements that we want to see. So not just let's give money to this one thing because it makes us feel good, but how do we do more than that to make sure we're raising money for the issues we care about? Because Black Lives Matter can't simply depend on donations from Google. It can't simply depend on donations from Beyonce and Jay-Z. And there's a very good reason for that. Not because Beyonce and Jay-Z don't have the money, Lord knows they do. But because the only way that a grassroots movement stays grassroots and stays committed to its principles is if it's accountable to those donors. Right? If it starts being accountable to Google, if it starts being accountable to the Annenberg Foundation or whatever other major philanthropic place that's giving them a lot of money, it's not accountable to the grassroots in the same way. So you build the pyramid of donors wide, and then you ladder them up. Because those of us who can't give $1 million right now might be able to give $1 million in 20 years. As I said, I didn't give a dime originally to that $1 million that we raised. But I pledged $500. And it took me as a poor graduate student 10 years, but I made that pledge. And so again, we can all be part of that donor base. When I talk about wealth transfer, here are some of the numbers. $41 trillion nationally will be passed on to different philanthropic sources. 41 trillion, that's with a TR, not B, not million. In Los Angeles alone, it'll be 114, and in Boston, it'll be 359. But what we don't know is how the increasing diversity of donors might shift people's priorities. So what we've been doing is to really look at what I call the Giving Black studies, and really think about how are donors actually different if they are Black as opposed to any other group. We've looked at how they divide their discretionary giving, and also sought to construct some donor profiles. And so we did about a survey of about 400 people in 2 different cities. We'd like to do some of this in North Carolina, but that's not yet happening. But the idea here was to construct donor profiles so that we could really help donors plug into how they give back some of their treasure. So in Los Angeles, we were able to identify 3 different types of donors: the Building the Black Community donors, the Issue Impact donors, and the Hardwired to Give donors. The Building the Black Community donors are the donors who say, I want to build the Black community. My donations are going to go to build the Black community. If you were raising money for the Stone Center, those are your donors, okay? There are other donors, the Issue Impact donors, who are really more concerned about an issue. They're focused on, I really want to transform education, or I really am interested in the arts, or I'm really interested in healthcare and making sure people have health access. And so again, they are going to be donating and swayed by a donor message that will be very different, something more targeted, but targeted in the issue and affecting a broad swath of the community. So we ask questions like, it's very important to me or not that my donations go to helping Black people. And there was, and I want to be very clear about this, a diversity of opinion about that. There were some donors in Los Angeles for whom that was extremely important. But there was another, about 40% between the Issue Impact and the Hardwired to Give, were giving to a Black cause simply because they themselves were Black was not the main issue. They were more concerned about the issue, or they were the kind of people, and I am this kind of person, I confess. My husband has to literally, whenever they're raising money or they're selling Girl Scout cookies or something outside the Harris Teeter over here or something else, I will say yes. Yes, you can have that $5 for the, the bag of groceries. Yes, AmVets, you can have this thing that I have not used since it was broken the first day I bought it. Yes, you can have clothes Goodwill. Yes, yes, yes. Okay. Those are those hardwired to give donors. And so again, you can craft a different pitch to them. We also did this study and replicated it in Boston. And what we saw was actually a flip. The majority of Boston donors, again, black. Okay, so this is black donors for both cities. The majority of Boston donors were focused on the issue. They wanted to create and leave a legacy of impact on an issue, whether it's entrepreneurship, whether it's the arts, whether it's healthcare, whether it's education. And it could affect a huge swath of different groups. The second most prevalent was the kinship donors. And they were very much like the Building the Black Community donors, focused on improving the black community. Didn't matter whether it was education, didn't matter whether it was entrepreneurship, didn't matter whether it was healthcare, didn't matter whether it was criminal justice. Was it going to help black people? They would give to it. And then the last group that we didn't find in Los Angeles, but we did find in Boston, were the sanctified donors. These are the folks who, through their faith, decided that they were going to give. And what's interesting about this in the Boston donor profile in particular was that this was not just limited to Christianity. We found members of the black Muslim community who were mandated through their Muslim faith to actually give whenever they are asked. That is part of what they are called to do as Muslims. And so there was this, again, group that gave because it was required or a tenet of their faith. We also developed this donor profile, again, to help people kind of decide where they actually stand. And so the next step is to think about how do we facilitate mainstream Black America's philanthropic expertise. In LA, we're hosting an event for Giving Tuesday that will actually get folks to learn about financial planning so that they can amplify their giving. In Boston, those folks actually wanted a virtual Boston Commons. So they knew they wanted to give, but they didn't know how to trust certain organizations. And so we're creating a virtual Boston Common for them so that they can go online and say, this organization is trustworthy. This organization, not so much. But not just trustworthy on things like the 990s and everything else that GuideStar can give you or Charity Navigator can give you, but on the issues that matter to them. How are they doing among Black communities for those cornerstone donors? How are they faith-based for those sanctified donors? So we're asking different questions. And then the last thing we want to think about is how do we leverage the diversity within? The Black community, as I talked about before, is not purely a single group. Not immigration-wise, not gender-wise, not sexuality-wise, not class-wise. And so we really want to think about leveraging that diversity within. One opportunity that I saw that relates to North Carolina more generally, not just to the Stone Center, is faith-based transformative organizing is something that has been effective. The PICO National Network has funded transformative organizing on some of the policy issues that you care about in North Carolina in 17 states, but I checked and North Carolina is not on the list. So here's an opportunity to think about that. The recent efforts of the PICO National Network included things like this idea of working and standing with Black women and girls. And it says up there, standing with Black women and girls is not an option, it is an obligation. So what do we do with our allies? How do you work with us? One of the things we have to think about in terms of allyship is this idea of deep political solidarity, which acknowledges all of the categories that we've been talking about, that beloved Black community. Those categories matter equally but not identically. So we can't be reductive and say just one category matters. The important thing about deep political solidarity in this moment, however, is that that solidarity addresses feelings of ambivalence and loss. It addresses that anxiety that we're talking about, that people will come to you and say, I've worked hard, I've done what I was supposed to do. Why should I care about you? Because I'm so anxious about where my kids are going to go. I'm so anxious about what's going on in my own family. I can't see my way clear to care about you. Deep political solidarity is designed to address that as real, rather than call somebody out and say, well, then you're just a racist if you don't care about me. Or you're just a sexist, or you're just a homophobe, or you're just a jerk if you don't care about me. Instead, deep political solidarity as a set of habits is designed to actually take those feelings and process those feelings. Not just can we get along on the surface and not really address what's underlying it. Because again, we're talking about transformative organizing, not just can we win the next election. So, those habits of deep political solidarity. And the reason I call them habits is because they're not one-off actions. It can't just be, oh, I voted for Obama, so clearly I'm not racist. Or, oh, I have a gay friend, so clearly I'm not homophobic. Okay? Habits are things that we do repeatedly. And that's really important for a couple of reasons. One, habits are things that we have to learn. So it's not, I can't learn this, I can't do this. Yes, you really can. The same way that you learn to ride a bike, you can learn to do this. The same way you learn to brush your teeth, you can learn to do solidarity. But just like the habit of brushing your teeth and the habit of riding a bike, if you remember back to when you learned how to ride a bike, anybody never fall off their bike when they were learning? I didn't think so. I have had audience where one person will raise their hand and I'll be like, and you're lying. Ask your mother, ask your father. They will tell you you fell off at least once. Because that's what you do when you're learning. And so the habits of solidarity I'm about to talk about are things that you need to be gentle with yourself and with others about learning. And that's really hard in this context because we feel like we don't have any wiggle room. We feel like you need to get it right now. And if you don't get it right now, then I need to put you down and get with somebody who can. Okay? And that's a way of shutting down what might otherwise be a very solid, solidaristic relationship. If you give that person the chance to learn it, give that person the chance to practice. So these habits include things like cultural empathy and emotional stability. So of course online we can have lots of snarky comments about certain people's tears and whether or not safety pins are really the right kind of method to go and everything else after the election here. But we do want to think about these habits as being habits that are applicable to everyone because everyone is trying to learn. The other thing it's important to think about when we think about these being a habit is you don't get to try it once and then forget about it. And say, oh, I didn't get that cultural empathy right, or I didn't get that open-mindedness right. Now I'll never get it. You know, you have to try again. You have to have the courage and the resilience to try and try and try until it gets better. But before you actually practice deep political solidarity, you really want to think about whether or not you're ready. And this is the conversation we don't always have with allies, we don't always have with our compañeras, and that our compañeras don't know to actually have with themselves. Am I ready? Is perhaps the most important question an ally or a compañera can ask themselves before they get involved. Because it can solve so many issues of unknowingly stepping, unknowingly triggering, unknowingly destroying a relationship. One of the first questions when we think about am I ready is confronting our implicit bias. Now I know those of you who are psych majors or if you've been reading anything about police reform in the past 2 years know what implicit bias is. You can go online and take the test at Project Implicit. Everyone has at least one in the United States. Most Americans do not have all 14. So you need to find out which ones you have so you can figure out how to fix them. For the neuroscientists, yes, implicit bias has been documented neuroscientifically. Those little orange lights on the image of the brain there, that fMRI, is implicit bias lighting up in an experiment. So this is not, I'm not a racist but, or I'm not a sexist but. These are hardwired in our brain. And the empirical literature has determined about 75% of whites and Asians have implicit biases about African Americans, but what they won't tell you is that 65% of African Americans have those same implicit biases about other African Americans. It is a product of the society we live in, not intent, not being mean, not being a jerk. It is what we are hardwired to do before we can walk or talk. The things you as parents, if there are parents in here, said in the minivan when you didn't think your kid was listening, that's how they learned implicit bias. Hard but true. We have some behavioral evidence of implicit bias. And again, these are conversations you can have about whether or not it happens at Carolina or whether it happens in other contexts like the public schools. Teachers unconsciously call more frequently on white and Asian students than on black students in classrooms. We know that that actually begins by some more recent research as early as preschool. So when we think about why black kids aren't doing as well in school or don't have strong feelings about staying in school because they're not having good experiences, we can think about implicit bias. This is also true on the level of gender. And so speaking to the election, one of the things that we know is that as early as middle school, girls prefer boys to be in leadership, not just boys preferring girls to be in leadership. So when you think about how many white women voted for for Donald Trump instead of Hillary Clinton last week, the narrative has been, oh, it's racism, oh, it's racism, oh, it's racism. It might actually also be implicit bias with regard to gender. Because just as African Americans believe biases about African Americans, so too do women believe biases about women. So you want to think about this in an intersectional way, thinking about race and gender together. The impact on black people of these implicit biases, so that you know why it's important to know which ones you have and to fix them if you have them, is that black people have increased risk of generalized anxiety disorder. And I didn't know there was going to be a public health person, but here you go. PTSD symptoms, stereotype threat. All of these are real diagnoses that emanate from blacks living in a chronically unsafe or hostile environment. So these are not kind of stories that are made up. These are things that people are living with because they are living in a place that feels unsafe. But what can we do about it? And so this is true for the compañeras and the compañeros, but it's also true for all of us. We can take the tests, we can use the principle of neuroplasticity to our own benefit, okay? And what that means is those habits of solidarity can be learned. Can be learned if you're 22, can be learned if you're 82, can be learned if you're 62. You do not need to be a certain age to learn them. You can also prime multiculturalism, and I'm very proud that I cite a UNC Law Review article here about how juries are able to make race salient and it affects the outcome of the criminal justice trial. And then the last and certainly not least thing is to acknowledge and recognize that your impact is greater than your intention. Many times when we're talking about race and racism, often the idea is I didn't mean to, or I'm not racist because I don't intend to be racist. And again, we want to change, and this is particularly what Black Lives Matter has been good about, the frame to think about whether or not the intention is there. This is the impact on our lives. The impact on our lives is that we die. The impact on our lives is that we are incarcerated. The impact on our lives is that we go out every day and put our kids in schools and are scared that they won't come home. The impact is greater than any single person's intention. What can we do about it post-2016 election? You may have friends who can't talk about the election. I, in fact, will say that this is the last time I'm going to talk about the election for a really long time. Because I'm not distracted by a sudden life change, although I did get married 3 weeks ago. I'm not dealing with or tired of having to pretend okay, but I'm too worn out. I can't keep talking about the same trauma over and over again. I need to take the time and the space to heal. And so acknowledging that you may have people that you want to process this election with, that you want to say, wasn't that horrible, or wasn't that this, or what are we going to do? And people may not be ready to have that conversation yet. People may be shut down. And so the individual thing we can all do is to really just say, okay, we need to meet people where they are. And to go through this election really thinking in a different way. So finally, where do we go from here? We realize that the idea of equity inclusion is now a necessity. Not a luxury, not just a moral good, but a necessity. We have to recognize that, like that signal spillover blowback cycle, collaboration and conflict are going to go together. We are not all going to get to kumbaya without having a few arguments along the way, without having a few missteps along the way, without having a few blips. And then last, we have to design targeted universalism policies, and we have to create unexpected alliances. So that means reaching out to the people that we think might not have anything to say to us. So we heal ourselves, we prepare ourselves, and we don't remain calm, but we do organize, organize, organize. Thank you.
Strongly believe in his Christian values as well. I'm a professional optimist. Like my parents might even say, my mother say, I have no risk aversion whatsoever. And so to a degree with this mentality, it's just, sometimes you question yourself if you're doing enough because you're always trying to find the right side of things and you're always trying to find ways to pull the pretty out of the ugly. And so with that, there's also the question like, am I doing enough? Am I doing enough being like a first generation student? Am I doing enough coming to UNC-Chapel Hill to get this degree while my fellow brothers and sisters were back at the Boys and Girls Club? There's a 6-year-old who's living in a homeless shelter. And so it's just like those contradicting thoughts sometimes that like sweep in. And so from your personal experiences, how have you dealt with that as well, my faith?
It's actually a really important question, and thank you so much for asking it. I should say that one of the things, I think the best things that happened to me here at UNC was kind of a renewal of my faith. And it started in the smallest of ways, and I mean that by, I simply went to a BSM gospel choir concert, and and just hearing them sing Total Praise, in a variety of different contexts, just took me to a different place in my level of faith. And so while I don't insist on faith, to be in alliance or in solidarity with anybody, it is a personal resource for me. One of the things that I've been, and I admit I'm still learning about this, so let me be clear, it has been helpful for me is to really, every single time, take it back to God in a very intentional way, right? And remember that anytime you feel like you are less than, that is usually not what God wants you to feel about yourself, right? Which is not to say he thinks you're perfect, but it's more to say, he will never fault you for not doing the millionth next thing, right? He will instead say, how can you really use what you have right now, and how do you kind of ladder it, right? So what can you do right now versus what can you do in 5 years versus what might you be able to do with that degree if you go back to that Boys and Girls Club, right? And that's really helped me kind of think about it. It's also really helped me to think about it in terms of my own health, my own ability to kind of like be there for people. Because it is hard work, right? That's part of what Dr. Stone's life and legacy was all about. Part of the reason we have this as a memorial lecture, though, is because she is no longer with us. And if we don't, and that's part of why I think transformative organizing is so important, and what Opal, Alicia, and Patrice are doing is so important, because it's not just about them, right? This is not a Martin Luther King-led movement. This is a movement designed to train all of us. And the reason we need all of us is because 1, 2, 3, 4, 7 of us can't do it, right? And so theirs is a secular movement, yes, but I think there is the LA Voice PICO, the LA part of the PICO network, is absolutely faith-based and has a real intentional way. So if you go to their website, lavoice.pico.net, I think it is, they have a lot of faith-based tools for organizing that also really take to the idea of self-care, to be like part of the balance of what it means to be a good steward of this world. Because being a good steward of this world is keeping yourself in it until God calls you home.
Hi, my name is Angum. I guess my question is how you dealt with this, or if you went through this. A part of the lecture that stuck with me the most is reaching out to people who might not agree with you, or especially when you brought up the Facebook thing. And I was very much like one of the two who tried to talk on an individual basis, and after a while that got very, very, very tiring and exhausting for me. And I know that a lot of other people that I've talked to, it's that burden of the oppressed constantly having to teach. So that has led to a lot of like built up anger and built up just blocking out people, like you said. And so basically I was wondering, how have you dealt with that anger, and how have you moved forward or balanced not constantly carrying that burden, but also trying to reach out to people?
I actually just did an article with Pop Sugar on this very topic. So the topic was kind of, we're entering the holidays, we're going to be with family we don't necessarily agree with, and they may say something completely off the, crazy train, and how do you deal with it? And I think first and foremost, one of the things that we don't give ourselves permission enough to do, that speaks back to this transformative organizing, is the permission to either step back, step away, or to say, you know what, that's not where I'm called to be right now. Either in a secular or a sacred space, and say, I can't do this, right? It's because part of, without psychoanalyzing, what you said, part of the anger and part of, I think, the upset and the anxiety that comes from that is feeling like nobody else is going to do it if I don't do it. Right? Nobody else is going to be that bridge. Nobody else is going to be, that person that's willing to kind of reach out. And that person's just going to linger in their, ignorance or their, hate or whatever it is. And I think you want to let yourself off the hook that you don't have to always be that person. And I mean that in the most gentlest of ways. Meaning that, not that you need to then go off on that person and say, I'm not going to educate you because Google can provide every resource that you need, which is easy to say in a Facebook kind of context, but more to say, picking your particular battles. And so I'll just give you a personal example from my life that's actually going on right now. So I have a good girlfriend from middle school. I grew up in Maryland, and she actually lives right here in Chapel Hill. And I have not contacted her, even though I've been in Chapel Hill for 2.5 days, because I know she voted for Donald Trump. I know that she posted things that were racially insensitive about Barack Obama on her Facebook page, but she deliberately doesn't put them on my page. Like, she'll exclude me from the shares, and it's only through a girlfriend we have in common who lives in New York who told me about this, right? And I really thought about it. I prayed on it. I was like, she's always so kind and loving to me about, oh, congratulations for getting married, and how you doing? Very kind of nice. But then I know she also holds these other views. And it really took me 48 hours, all day Saturday, I was like, am I going to message Meg? Sunday, am I going to message Meg? And I just decided to, I'm not strong enough today. I'm not strong enough on Sunday, and today's her birthday, and I wished her a happy birthday on Facebook, but I just couldn't go there this time around, Now, a year from now, or even 6 months from now, if I was back in Chapel Hill, I might feel strong enough to do that. So I try not to make it a permanent decision that she's completely X'd out of my life. But on the other hand, I don't feel strong enough right now, and my value to the movement is not talking Meg into, agreeing with me right now, because I don't have the strength and the resources, and I need to be okay with that in myself, right? To say, I'm not hating Meg, I'm not excluding her from my life right now, but I also can't talk with her about this. I just don't have the resources, and I'm okay with the fact that I don't have the resources to do that right now. If my friend Karen, who, told me about this, if she wants to go all out against Meg, vaya con Dios, but right now, if I'm not the one, and that needs to be okay.
Hi, how are you?
Hi.
My name is Maurice. I just had a brief question. So